Chapter 3: Deciding and Choosing. Choosing well is difficult, and most decisions have several different dimensions. When leasing an apartment, you consider location, spaciousness, conditions, safety, and rent. When buying a car, you look at safety, reliability, fuel economy, style, and price. When choosing a job, it is a salary, location, opportunity for advancement, potential colleagues, as well as the nature of the work itself that factor into your deliberations. Most good decisions will involve these steps. 1. Figure out your goal or goals. Evaluate the importance of each goal. Array the options. Evaluate how likely each of the options is to meet your goals. Pick the winning option. Later use the consequences of your choice to modify your goals, the importance you assign them, and the way you evaluate future possibilities. For example, after renting an apartment, you might discover that easy access to shopping and public transportation turned out to be more important and spaciousness less important than you thought when you signed the lease. Next time around, you'll weight those factors differently. Even with a limited number of options, going through this process can be hard work. As the number of options increases, the effort required to make a good decision escalates as well, which is one of the reasons that choice can be transformed from a blessing into a burden. It is also one of the reasons that we don't always manage the decision-making task effectively. Knowing your goals. The process of goal setting and decision-making begins with a question: what do I want? On the surface, this looks as if it should be easy to answer. The welter of information out there in the world, notwithstanding, what do I want is addressed largely through internal dialogue. But knowing what we want means, in essence, being able to anticipate accurately how one choice or another will make us feel. And that is no simple task. Whenever you eat a meal in a restaurant, or listen to a piece of music, or go to a movie, you either like the experience or you don't. The way that the meal or the music or the movie makes you feel in the moment, either good or bad, could be called experienced utility. But before you actually have the experience, you have to choose it. You have to pick a restaurant, a CD, or a movie, and you make these choices based upon how you expect the experiences to make you feel. So choices are based upon expected utility. And once you have had experience with particular restaurants, CDs, or movies, future choices will be based upon what you remember about these past experiences. In other words, on their remembered utility. To say that we know what we want, therefore, means that these three utilities align, with expected utility being matched by experienced utility, and experienced utility faithfully reflected in remembered utility. The trouble is, though, that these three utilities rarely line up so nicely. Nobel Prize winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman and his colleagues have shown that what we remember about the pleasurable quality of our past experiences is almost entirely determined by two things: how the experiences felt when they were at their peak, best or worst, and how they felt when they ended. This peak end rule of Kahneman's is what we use to summarize the experience, and then we rely on that summary later to remind ourselves of how the experience felt. The summaries in turn influence our decisions about whether to have that experience again, and factors such as the proportion of pleasure to displeasure during the course of the experience or how long the experience lasted have almost no influence on our memory of it. Here's an example. Participants in a laboratory study were asked to listen to a pair of very loud and pleasant noises played through headphones. One noise lasted for 8 seconds, the other lasted 16. The first 8 seconds of the second noise were identical to the first noise, whereas the second 8 seconds, while still loud and unpleasant, were not as loud. Later, the participants were told that they would have to listen to one of the noises again, but that they could choose which one. Clearly, the second noise is worse. The unpleasantness lasted twice as long. Nonetheless, the overwhelming majority of people chose the second to be repeated. Why? Because whereas both noises were unpleasant and had the same aversive peak, the second had a less unpleasant end, and so was remembered as less annoying than the first. Here is another quite remarkable example of the peak-end rule in operation. Men undergoing diagnostic colonoscopy exams were asked to report how they felt moment by moment while having the exam and how they felt when it was over. Most people find these exams in which a tube with a tiny camera on the end is inserted up the rectum and then moved around to allow the inspection of the gastrointestinal system quite unpleasant. So much so that patients avoid getting regular tests, much to their peril. In the test, one group of patients had a standard colonoscopy, a second group had a standard colonoscopy plus. The plus was that after the actual examination was over, the doctor left the instrument in place for a short time. This was still unpleasant, but much less so because the scope wasn't moving. Note that both groups of patients were having their colonoscopies for legitimate medical reasons. They were not subjecting themselves to these procedures just for the sake of the experiment. So the second group experienced the same moment by moment discomfort as the first group, with the addition of somewhat lesser discomfort for 20 seconds more. And that is what they reported, moment by moment, as they were having the procedure. But a short time after it was over, the second group rated their experience as less unpleasant than did the first. Whereas both groups had the same peak experience, the second group had a milder end experience. And it made a difference. It turned out that over a 5-year period after this exam, patients in the second group were more likely to comply with the calls for follow-up colonoscopies than patients in the first group because they remembered their experiences as less unpleasant. They were less inclined to avoid them in the future. In the same way, we evaluate positive experiences on the basis of how good they feel at their best and how good they feel at the end. Thus, you might, in retrospect, remember a 1-week vacation that had some great moments and finished with a bang as more pleasurable than a 3-week vacation that also had some great moments but finished only with a whimper. The 2 extra weeks of relaxing in the sun or seeing the sights of eating great food make little difference because they recede from awareness over time. So how well do we know what we want? It's doubtful that we would truly prefer intense pain followed by mild pain over experiencing intense pain alone. It's unlikely that a great 1-week vacation is truly better than a great single week followed by a pretty good 2 weeks vacation. But that's what people say they prefer. The discrepancy between logic and memory suggests that we don't always know what we want. Another illustration of our lack of self-knowledge comes from a study in which researchers asked a group of college students to choose a series of snacks. Each week, they had a 3-hour seminar with one break that allowed participants to stretch their legs, use the bathroom, clear their heads, and have something to eat. When the professor asked the students to pick a snack for each of the next 3 weeks, the students picked a variety thinking they'd get tired of the same snack each week. In contrast, another group in the same study got to choose their snacks every week, and these students, choosing for 1 week at a time, tended to choose the same thing each week. These two sets of participants were faced with different tasks. The students who were choosing one snack at a time simply had to ask themselves what they felt like eating at the moment. Those who were choosing for the 3 weeks had to predict what they would feel like eating 2 or 3 weeks from the moment of choice. And they got the prediction wrong, no doubt thinking that their low enthusiasm for pretzels after having just eaten a bag was how they would feel about pretzels a week later. People who do their grocery shopping once a week succumb to the same erroneous prediction. Instead of buying several packages of their favorite X or Y, they buy a variety of X's and Y's, failing to predict accurately that when the time comes to eat X or Y, they should almost certainly prefer their favorite. In a laboratory simulation of this grocery shopping situation, participants were given 8 categories of basic foods and asked to imagine doing their shopping for the day and buying one item in each category. Having done this, they were asked to imagine doing it again the next day and so on for several days. In contrast, another group of people were asked to imagine going shopping to buy 3 days worth of food and thus selecting 3 things in each category. People in this latter group made more varied selections within each category than people in the former group, predicting inaccurately that they would want something different on day 2 from what they had eaten on day 1. So it seems that neither our predictions about how we feel after an experience nor our memories of how we did feel during the experience are very accurate reflections of how we actually do feel while the experience is occurring. And yet, it's memories of the past and expectations for the future that govern our choices. In a world of expanding, confusing, and conflicting options, we can see that this difficulty in targeting our goals accurately, step one on the path to a wise decision, sets us up for disappointment with the choices we actually make. Gathering information. However well or poorly we determine our goals before making a decision, having set them, we then go through the task of gathering information to evaluate the options. To do this, we review our past experience as well as the experience and expertise of others. We talk to friends, we read consumer investment or lifestyle magazines, we get recommendations from salespeople, and increasingly we use the internet. But more than anything else, we get information from advertising. The average American sees 3,000 ads a day. As advertising professor James Twitchell puts it, ads are what we know about the world around us. So we don't have to do our choosing alone and unaided. Once we figure out what we want, we can use various resources to help evaluate the options. But we need to know that the information is reliable and we need to have enough time to get through all the information that's available. 3,000 ads a day breaks down to about 200 per waking hour. More than 3 per waking minute, and that is an overwhelming amount to sift through. Quality and quantity of information. To accommodate the ever-increasing number of ads, your favorite sitcom has about 4 fewer program minutes than it did a generation ago. On top of that, the advent of cable TV and its many channels has brought with it the infomercial, a show that is an ad masquerading as entertainment. Newspapers and magazines contain hundreds of pages of which just a small fraction are devoted to content. Movie producers now place branded products in their films for high fees. Increasingly, sports stadiums are named for a sponsoring company, often at a fee of several $1 million a year. Every race car is tattooed with brand names, as are many athletes' uniforms. Even public television now has ads disguised as public service announcements at the start and end of almost every show. Unfortunately, providing consumers with useful decision-making information is not the point of all this advertising. The point of advertising is to sell brands. According to James Twitchell, the key insight that has shaped modern advertising came to cigarette manufacturers in the 1930s. In the course of market research, they discovered that smokers who tasted various cigarette brands without knowing which was which couldn't tell them apart. So if the manufacturer wanted to sell more of this particular brand, he was either going to have to make it distinctive or make consumers think it was distinctive, which was considerably easier. With that, with that was born the practice of selling a product by associating it with a glamorous lifestyle. We probably like to think that we are too smart to be seduced by such branding, but we aren't. If you ask test participants in a study to explain their preference in music or art, they'll come up with some account based on the qualities of the pieces themselves. Yet several studies have demonstrated that familiarity breeds liking. If you play snippets of music for people or show them slides of painting and vary the number of times they hear or see the music and the art, on the whole, people will rate the familiar things more positively than the unfamiliar ones. The people doing the ratings don't know that they like one bit of music more than another because it's more familiar. Nonetheless, when products are essentially equivalent, people go with what's familiar, even if it's only familiar because they know its name from advertising. If people want real information, they have to go beyond advertising to disinterested sources such as Consumer Reports. Its publisher, Consumers Union, is an independent non-profit organization whose mission is to help consumers. It does not allow any of its reports or ratings to be used in advertising, nor does the magazine contain any commercial advertising. When it was launched about 75 years ago, Consumer Reports offered comparisons among things like grade A milk and grade B milk. Today, it offers comparison among 220 new car models, 250 breakfast cereals, 400 BCRs, 40 household soaps, 500 health insurance policies, 350 mutual funds, and even 35 shower heads. And this barely scratches the surface. For every type of product that Consumer Report evaluates, there are many that it passes over, and new models appear with such frequency that the evaluations are at least slightly out of date by the time they are published. The same limitation is true, of course, of other, more specialized guides, travel guides, college guides, and the like. The internet can give us information that is absolutely up to the minute, but as a resource, it is democratic to a fault. Everyone with a computer and an internet hookup can express their opinion, whether they know anything or not. The avalanche of electronic information we now face is such that in order to solve the problem of choosing from among 200 brands of cereal or 5,000 mutual funds, we must first solve the problem of choosing from 10,000 websites offering to make us informed consumers. If you want to experience this problem for yourself, pick some prescription drug that is now being marketed directly to you. Then do a web search to find out what you can about the drug that goes beyond what the ads tell you. I just tried it for Prilosec, one of the largest selling prescription medication in existence, which is heavily advertised by its manufacturers. I got more than 20,000 hits. And there is good evidence that the absence of filters on the internet can lead people astray. The RAND Corporation recently conducted an assessment of the quality of websites providing medical information and found that, with rare exceptions, they are all doing an equally poor job. Important information was omitted, and sometimes the information presented was misleading or inaccurate. Moreover, surveys indicate that these websites actually influence the health-related decisions of 70% of the people who consult them. Evaluating the information, even if we can accurately determine what we want and then find good information in a quantity we can handle, do we really know how to analyze, sift, weigh, and evaluate it to arrive at the right conclusions and make the right choices? Not always. Spearheaded by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, researchers have spent the last 30 years studying how people make decisions. Their work documents the variety of rules of thumb we use that often lead us astray as we try to make wise decisions. Availability. Imagine that you are in the market for a new car and that you care about only two things: safety and reliability. You dutifully check out Consumer Reports, which rates Volvo highest for safety and reliability, so you resolve to buy a Volvo. That evening, you are at a cocktail party and you mention your decision to a friend. You're not going to buy a Volvo, she says. My friend Jane bought one about 6 months ago and she's had nothing but trouble. First, there was an oil leak, then she had trouble starting it, then the tape player started muggling her tapes. She's had it in the shop maybe 5 times in the 6 months she's owned it. You might feel lucky to have had this conversation before making a terrible mistake, but actually, maybe you're not so fortunate. Consumer Reports makes its judgment about the reliability of cars by soliciting input from its thousands and thousands of readers. It compiles this input into an estimate of reliability for each make and model of car. So when Consumer Reports says that a car is reliable, it is basing its conclusion on the experience of thousands of people with the same story to tell. But on average, the reports of Volvo owners are more positive about reliability than the reports of the owners of other cars. Now, along comes this friend to tell you about one particular Volvo owner and one particular Volvo. How much weight should you give this story? Should it undo conclusions based on the thousands of cases assessed by Consumer Reports? Of course not. Logically, it should have almost no influence on your decision. Unfortunately, most people give substantial weight to this kind of anecdotal evidence, perhaps so much so that it will cancel out the positive recommendation found in Consumer Reports. Most of us give weight to these kinds of stories because they are extremely vivid and based on personal, detailed, face-to-face account. Kahneman and Tversky discovered and reported on people's tendency to give undue weight to some type of information in contrast to others. They called it the availability heuristic. This needs a little explaining. A heuristic is a rule of thumb, a mental shortcut. The availability heuristic works like this. Suppose someone asks you a silly question like, what's more common in English words that begin with the letter T or words that have T as the third letter? How would you answer this question? What you probably would do is try to call to mind words that start with T and words that have T as the third letter. You would then discover that you had as much easier time generating the words that start with T. So words starting with T would be more available to you than words that have T as the third letter. You will then reason roughly as follows. In general, the more often we encounter something, the easier it is for us to recall it in the future. Because I had an easier time recalling words that start with T than recalling words with T as the third letter. I must have encountered them more often in the past. So there must be more words in English that starts with T than have it as the third letter. But your conclusion would be wrong. The availability heuristic says that we assume that the more available some piece of information is to memory, the more frequently we must have encountered it in the past. This heuristic is partly true. In general, the frequency of experience does affect its availability to memory, but frequency of experience is not the only thing that affects availability to memory. Salience or vividness matters as well, because starting letters of words are much more salient than third letters. They are much more useful as cues for retrieving words from memory. So it's the salience of starting letters that makes T words come easily to mind, while people mistakenly think it's the frequency of starting letters that make them come easily to mind. In addition to affecting the ease with which we retrieve information from memory, salience or vividness will influence the weight we give any particular piece of information. There are many examples of the availability of heuristic in operation. When college students who are deciding what courses to take next semester are presented with summaries of course evaluations from several hundred students that point in one direction and a videotaped interview with a single student that points in the other direction, they are more influenced by the vivid interview than by the summary judgments of hundreds. Vivid interviews with people have profound effects on judgment even when people are told in advance of seeing the interviews that the subjects of the interview are atypical. Thus, seeing an interview of an especially vicious or humane prison guard or an especially industrious or slothful welfare recipient shifts people's opinion of prison guards or welfare recipients in general. When spouses are asked separately a series of questions about what's good and bad about their marriage, each spouse holds him or herself more responsible than his or her partner. For both the good and the bad, people's natural egocentrism makes it much easier to bring their own actions to mind than those of their partner. Because our own actions are more available to us from memory, we assume they are more frequent. Now consider the availability heuristic in the context of advertising, whose main objective is to make products appear salient and vivid. Does a particular car maker give safety a high priority in manufacture of its cars? When you see film footage of a crash test in which a $50,000 car is driven into a wall, it's hard to believe the car company doesn't care about safety, no matter what the crash test statistics say. How we assess risk offers another example of how our judgments can be distorted by availability. In one study, researchers asked respondents to estimate the number of deaths per year that occur as a result of various diseases, car accidents, natural disasters, electrocutions, and homicides. 40 different types of misfortune in all. The researchers then compared people's answers to actual death rates with striking results. Respondents judged accidents of all types to cause as many deaths as diseases of all types, when in fact diseases causes 16 times more deaths than accidents. Death by homicide was thought to be as frequent as death from stroke, when in fact 11 times more people die of stroke than from homicides. In general, dramatic, vivid causes of death, accident, homicide, tornado, flood, fire, were overestimated, whereas more mundane causes of death, diabetes, asthma, stroke, tuberculosis, were underestimated. Where did these estimates come from? The authors of study looked at two newspapers published on opposite sides of the US, and they counted the number of stories involving various causes of death. What they found was that the frequency of newspaper coverage and the respondents' estimate of the frequency of death were almost perfectly correlated. People mistook the pervasiveness of the newspaper stories about homicides, accidents, or fires, vivid, salient, and easily available to memory, as a sign of the frequency of the events these stories profile. This distortion causes us to miscalculate dramatically the various risks we face in life and thus contributes to some very bad choices. What often saves us from our faulty decision making process is that different people experience different vivid or salient events and thus have different events available to memory. You may have just read that Kias are actually very safe and you are set to buy one. You mentioned this to me, but I've just read a story about a Kia being crushed by an SUV in an accident. So I tell you about my vivid memory and that convinces you to revise your opinion. We are all susceptible to making errors, but we are not each susceptible to making the same errors because our experiences are different. As long as we include social interaction in our information gathering and as long as our sources of information are diverse, we can probably steer clear of the worst pitfalls. The benefit of multi-individual information assessment is nicely illustrated by a demonstration that financial analyst Paul Johnson has done over the years. He asks students to predict who will win the Academy Award in several different categories. He tabulates the predictions and comes up with group predictions, the nominees chosen by the most people for each category. What he finds again and again is that the group predictions are better than the predictions of any individual. In 1998, for example, the group picked 11 out of 12 winners, while the average individual in the group picked only 5 out of 12, and even the best individual picked only 9. But while diversity of individual experience can limit our propensity to choose in error, how much can we count on diversity of experience? As the number of choices we face continues to escalate and the amount of information we need escalates with it, we may find ourselves increasingly relying on second-hand information rather than on personal experience. Moreover, as telecommunications becomes ever more global, each of us, no matter where we are, may end up relying on the same second-hand information. National news sources such as CNN or USA Today tell everyone in the country and now even the world the same story, which makes it less likely that an individual's biased understanding of the evidence will be corrected by his friends and neighbors. Those friends and neighbors will have the same biased understanding derived from the same source. When you hear the same story everywhere you look and listen, you assume it must be true. And the more people believe it's true, the more likely they are to repeat it, and thus the more likely you are to hear it. This is how inaccurate information can create a bandwagon effect, leading quickly to a broad but mistaken consensus. Anchoring. Sensitivity to availability is not our only Achilles heel. When it comes to making information or informed choices, how do you determine how much to spend on a suit? One way is to compare the price of one suit to another, which means using the other items as an anchor or standard. In a store that displays suits costing over $1,500 and $800 print stripe may seem like a good buy. But in a store which most of the suits cost less than $500, that same $800 suit might seem like an extravagance. So which is it? A good buy or a self-indulgence? Unless you are on a strict budget, there are no absolutes. In this kind of evaluation, any particular item will always be at the mercy of the context in which it is found. On high-end catalog seller of mostly kitchen equipment and gourmet foods offered an automatic bread maker for $279. Some time later, the catalog began to offer a larger capacity deluxe version for $429. They didn't sell too many of these expensive bread makers, but sales of the less expensive one almost doubled. With the expensive bread maker serving as an anchor, the $279 machine had become a bargain. Anchoring is why department stores seem to have some of their merchandise on sale most of the time, to give the impression that customers are getting a bargain. The original ticket price becomes an anchor against which the sale price is compared. A more finely tuned example of the importance of the context of comparison comes from a study of supermarket shoppers done in the 1970s, shortly after unit pricing started appearing on the shelves just beneath the various items. When unit price information appeared on shelf tags, shoppers saved an average of 1% on their grocery bills. They did so mostly by purchasing the larger size packages of whatever brand they bought. However, when unit prices appeared on lists comparing different brands, shoppers saved an average of 3% on their bills. They did so now mostly by purchasing not larger sizes but cheaper brands. To understand the difference, think about how most supermarket shelves are arranged. Different size packages of the same brand are typically adjacent to each other. In this case, what the shopper gets to see side by side is the small, large, and family sizes of the same item along with their respective unit prices. This makes it easy to compare unit prices within the same brand. To compare unit prices across brands might require walking from one end of the aisle to the other. The multi-brand list of unit prices makes it easier for shoppers to do cross-brand comparison, and when such comparisons are easy to make, shoppers follow through and act on the information. When we see outdoor gas grills on the market for $8,000, it seems quite reasonable to buy one for $1,200. When a wristwatch that is no more accurate than one you can buy for $50 sells for $20,000, it seems reasonable to buy one for $2,000. Even if companies sell almost none of their highest priced models, they can reap enormous benefits from producing such models because they help induce people to buy their cheaper but still extremely expensive ones. Alas, there seems to be little we can do to avoid being influenced by the alternatives that anchor our comparison processes. Frames and accounts and context that influence choice can also be created by language. Imagine two gas stations at opposite corners of a busy intersection. One offers a discount for cash transactions and has a big sign that says discount for paying cash. Cash $1.45 per gallon. Credit $1.55 per gallon. The other, imposing a surcharge for credit, has a small sign just above the pumps that say cash $1.45 per gallon, credit $1.55 per gallon. The sign is small and doesn't call attention to itself because people don't like surcharges. Beyond the difference in presentation, though, there is no difference in the price structure at these two gas stations. A discount for paying cash is effectively the same as a surcharge for paying credit. Nonetheless, fuel-hungry consumers will have very different subjective responses to the two different propositions. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky call this effect framing. What determines whether a given price represents a discount or a surcharge? Consumers certainly can't tell from the price itself. In addition to the current price, potential buyers would need to know the standard or reference price. If the reference price of gas is $1.55, then those who pay cash are getting a discount. If the reference price is $1.45, then those who use credit are paying a surcharge. What the two gas station proprietors are offering is two different assumptions about the reference price of gas. The effects of framing become even more powerful when the stakes are higher. Imagine that you are a physician working in an Asian village and 600 people have come down with a life-threatening disease. Two possible treatments exist. If you choose treatment A, you will save exactly 200 people. If you choose treatment B, there is a 1/3 chance that you will save all 600 people and a 2/3 chance that you will save no one. Which treatment do you choose, A or B? The vast majority of respondents faced with this choice choose treatment A. They prefer saving a definite number of lives for sure to the risk that they will save no one. But now consider this slightly different problem. You are a physician working in an Asian village and 600 people have comes down with a life-threatening disease. Two possible treatments exist. If you choose treatment C, exactly 400 people will die. If you choose treatment D, there is a 1/3 chance that no one will die and a 2/3 chance that everyone will die. Which treatment do you choose, C or D? Now, the overwhelming majority of respondents choose treatment D. They would rather risk losing everyone than settle for the death of 400. It seems to be a fairly general principle that when making choices among alternatives that involve a certain amount of risk or uncertainty, we prefer a smaller, sure gain to a larger, uncertain one. Most of us, for example, will choose a sure $100 over a coin flip, a 50-50 chance that determines whether we win $200 or nothing. When the possibilities involves losses, however, we will risk a large loss to avoid a smaller one. For example, we will choose a coin flip that determines whether we lose $200 or nothing over a sure loss of $100. But the fact of the matter is that the dilemma facing the physician in each the two cases above is actually the same. If there are 606 people saving 200 choice A in the first problem means losing 400 choice C in the second problem. A two-thirds chance of saving no one choice B in the first problem means a two-thirds chance of losing everyone choice D in the second problem. And yet, based on one presentation, people chose risk, and based on the other, certainty. Just as in the matter of discounts and surcharges, it is the framing of the choice that affects our perception of it, and in turn affects what we choose. Now let's look at another pair of questions. Imagine that you have decided to see a concert where admission is $20 a ticket. As you enter the concert hall, you discover that you have lost a $20 bill. Would you still pay $20 for a ticket to the concert? Almost 90% of respondents says yes. In contrast, imagine that you have decided to see a concert and already purchased a $20 ticket. As you enter the concert hall, you discover that you have lost the ticket. The seat was not marked and the ticket cannot be recovered. Would you pay $20 for another ticket? In this situation, less than 50% of respondents says yes. What is the difference between these two cases? From the perspective of the bottom line, they appear the same. Both involve a choice between seeing a concert and being $40 poorer, or not seeing it and being $20 poorer. Yet, obviously, we don't seem to see them as the same, because so many respondents chose differently in the two cases. Kahneman and Tversky suggest that the difference between the two cases has to do with the way in which we frame our psychological accounts. Suppose that in a person's psychological ledger, there is a cost of the concert account. In the first case, the cost of the concert is $20 charged to that account, but the lost $20 bill is charged to some other account, perhaps miscellaneous account. But in the second case, the cost of the concert is $40. The cost of the lost ticket plus the cost of the replacement ticket, both charged to the same account. The range of possible frames or accounting systems we might use is enormous. For example, an evening at a concert could be just one entry in a much larger account, say a meeting a potential mate account, because you are going out in the hope of meeting someone who shares your interests, or it could be part of a getting culture account, in which case it would be one entry among others that might include subscribing to public television, buying certain books and magazines, and the like. It could be part of a ways to spend a Friday night account, in which case it would join entries like hanging out at a bar, going to a basketball game, or staying home and dozing in front of the television. How much this night at a concert is worth will depend on which account it is a part of. $40 may be a lot to spend for a way to fill Friday evening, but not much to spend to find a mate. In sum, just how well this $40 night at the concert satisfies you will depend on how you do your accounting. People often talk jokingly about how creative accountants can make a corporate balance sheet look as good or as bad as they want it to look. Well, the point here is that we are all creative accountants when it comes to keeping our own psychological balance sheet. Frames and prospects. Kahneman and Tversky have used their research on framing and its effects to construct a general explanation of how we go about evaluating options and making decisions. They call it prospect theory. If you look at the diagram above, you see objective states of affairs along the horizontal axis, positive to the right of the vertical axis, and negative to the left of it. These might be gains or losses of money, gains or losses of status on the job, gains or losses in your golf handicap, and so on. Along the vertical axis are subjective or psychological responses to these changes in states of their affairs. How good do people feel when they win $1,000 at the racetrack? How bad do people feel when their golf handicap goes up 3 strokes? If psychological responses to changes were perfectly faithful, reflections of these changes or of those changes, the curve relating to the objective to the subjective would be a straight line that went right through the 0 point or origin of the graph. But as you can see, that is not the case. To figure out why prospect theory gives us this curve rather than a straight line, let's look at the two halves of the graph separately. The top right portion of the graph depicts responses to the positive events. The thing to notice about this curve is that its steepness decreases as it moves further to the right. Thus, an objective gain of, say, $100 may give 10 units of subjective satisfaction, but a gain of $200 won't give 20 units of satisfaction. It will give, say, 18 units. As the magnitude of the gain increases, the amount of additional satisfaction people get out of each additional unit decreases. The shape of this curve conforms to what economists have long talked about as the law of diminishing marginal utility. As the rich get richer, each additional unit of wealth satisfies them less. With the graph of prospect theory in view, think about this question. Would you rather have $100 for sure or have me flip a coin and give you $200 if it comes up heads and nothing if it comes up tails? Most people ask this question go for the sure $100. Let's see why. A sure $100 and a 50-50 chance for $200 are in some sense equivalent. The fact that the payoff for the risky choice is double the payoff for the sure thing exactly compensates for the fact that the chances you'll get the payoff are halved. But if you look at the graph, you'll see that psychologically, you won't feel twice as good with $200 in your pocket as you will with $100 in your pocket. You'll feel about 1.7 times as good. So to make the gamble psychologically worthwhile to you, I'd have to offer you something like $240 for a heads. Thus, Kahneman and Tversky point out, people tend to avoid taking risks. They are risk averse when they are deciding among potential gains, potential positive outcomes. Now let's look at the other side of the graph, which depicts response to losses. It too is a curve, not a straight line. So suppose I ask you this question. Would you rather lose $100 for sure or have me flip a coin so that you lose $200 if it comes up heads and you lose nothing if it comes up tails? As in the last example, double the amount is compensated for by half the chances. If you don't like risk in the first problem, you probably won't like them in the second either. This suggests you'll take the sure loss of $100. But chances are you didn't, and the graph tells us why. Notice that the curve falls steeply at the beginning and then gradually levels off. This reflects what might be called the decreasing marginal disutility of losses. Losing the first 100 hurts worse than losing the second 100. So although losing 200 may be twice as bad objectively as losing 100, it is not twice as bad subjectively. What that means is that taking the risk to perhaps avoid losing anything is a pretty good deal. Thus, Kahneman and Tversky again point out, people embrace risk, they are risk seeking in the domain of potential losses. There is another feature of the graph worth noting. The loss portion of the graph is much steeper than the gain portion. Losing $100 produces a feeling of negativity that is more intense than the feeling of elation produced by a gain. Some studies have estimated that losses have more than twice the psychological impact as equivalent gains. The fact is, we all hate to lose, which Kahneman and Tversky refer to as loss aversion. The last and crucial element to the graph is the location of the neutral point. This is the dividing line between what counts as a gain and what counts as a loss. And here, too, subjectivity rules. When there is a difference in price between cash and credit at the gas station, is it a discount for cash or a surcharge for credit? If you think it's a discount for cash, then you are setting your neutral point at the credit card price, and paying cash is a gain. If you think it's a surcharge, then you're setting your neutral point at the cash price, and using your credit card is a loss. So fairly subtle manipulations of wording can affect what the neutral point is and whether we are thinking in terms of gains or losses. And these manipulations will in turn have profound effects on the decisions we make, effects that we really don't want them to have, since in an important sense, discounts and such surcharges are just two ways of saying the same thing. In the same way, we give disproportionate weight to whether yogurt is said to be 5% fat or 95% fat-free. People seem to think that yogurt that is 95% fat-free is a more healthful product than yogurt that has 5% fat, not realizing apparently that yogurt with 5% fat is 95% fat-free. Or suppose you are one of a large group of participants in a study, and for your time and trouble you are given either a coffee mug or a nice pen. The two gifts are of roughly equal value and randomly distributed. Half of the people in the room get one, while the other half get the other. You and your fellow participants are then given the opportunity to trade. Considering the random distribution, you will think that about half the people in the group would have gotten the object they preferred, and that the other half would be happy to swap. But in fact, there are very few trades. This phenomenon is called the endowment effect. Once something is given to you, it's yours. Once it becomes part of your endowment, even after a very few minutes, giving it up will entail a loss. And as prospect theory tells us, because losses are more bad than gains or good, the mug or pen with which you have been endowed is worth more to you than it is to a potential trading partner. And losing, giving up the pen will hurt worse than gaining, trading for. The mug will give pleasure. Thus, you won't make the trade. The endowment effect helps explain why companies can afford to offer money-back guarantees on their products. Once people own them, the products are worth more to their owners than the mere cash value, because giving up the products would entail a loss. Most interestingly, people seem to be utterly unaware that the endowment effect is operating, even as it distorts their judgment. In one study, participants were given a mug to examine and asked to write down the price they would demand for selling it if they owned it. A few minutes later, they were actually given the mug, along with the opportunity to sell it. When they owned the mug, they demanded 30% more to sell it than they had said they would only a few minutes earlier. One study compared the way in which the endowment effect influences people to make car buying decisions under two conditions. In one condition, they were offered the car loaded with options, and their task was to eliminate the options they didn't want. In the second condition, they were offered the car devoid of options, and their task was to add the ones they wanted. People in the first condition ended up with many more options than people in the second. This is because when options are already attached to the car being considered, they become part of the endowment, and passing them up entails a feeling of loss. When the options are not already attached, they are not part of the endowment, and choosing them is perceived as a gain. But because losses hurt more than gains satisfy, people judging, say, a $400 stereo upgrade that is part of the car's endowment may decide that giving it up a loss will hurt worse than its $400 price. In contrast, when upgrading is not part of the car's endowment, they may decide that choosing it again won't produce $400 worth of good feeling. So the endowment effect is operating even before people actually close the deal on their new car. Aversion to losses also leads people to be sensitive to what are called sunk costs. Imagine having a $50 ticket to a basketball game being played an hour's drive away. Just before the game, there's a big snowstorm. Do you still want to go? Economists would tell us that the way to assess a situation like this is to think about the future, not the past. The $50 is already spent, it's sunk, and can't be recovered. What matters is whether you'll feel better safe and warm at home, watching the game on TV, or slogging through the snow on treacherous roads to see the game in person. That's all that should matter. But it isn't all that matters. To stay home is to incur a loss of $50, and perhaps people hate people hate losses, so they drag themselves out to the game. Economist Richard Taylor provides another example of sunk costs that I suspect many people can identify with. You buy a pair of shoes that turn out to be really uncomfortable. What will you do about them? Taylor suggests. The more expensive they were, the more often you'll try to wear them. Eventually, you'll stop wearing them, but you won't get rid of them. And the more you paid for them, the longer they'll sit in the back of your closet. At some point, after the shoes have been fully depreciated psychologically, you will finally throw them away. Is there anyone who does not have some item of clothing sitting unused and never to be used in a drawer or a nutshell? Information gathering in a world with too many options. In this chapter, we've seen some of the mistakes people can make predicting what they want, gathering information about alternatives, and evaluating what that information is all about. The evidence clearly demonstrates that people are susceptible to error even when choosing among a handful of alternatives to which they can devote their full attention. Susceptibility to error can only get worse as the number and complexity of decisions increase, which in general describes the conditions of daily life. Nobody has the time or cognitive resource to be completely thorough and accurate with every decision. And as more decisions are required and more options are available, the challenge of doing the decision making correctly becomes even more difficult to meet. With many decisions, the consequences of error may be trivial, a small price to pay for the wealth of choices available to us. But with some, the consequences of error may be quite severe. We may make bad investments because we are not well informed enough about the tax consequences of investing in the various possibilities. We may choose the wrong health plan because we don't have time to read all the fine print. We may go to the wrong school, choose the wrong courses, embark on the wrong career, all because of the way in which the options were presented to us. As we find more and more important decisions on our plates, we may be forced to make many of these decisions with inadequate reflection. And in these cases, the stakes can be high. Even with relatively unimportant decisions, mistakes can take a toll. When you put a lot of time and effort into choosing a restaurant or a place to go on vacation or a new item of clothing, you want that effort to be rewarded with a satisfying result. As options increase, the effort involved in making decisions increases, so mistakes hurt even more. Thus, the growth of options and opportunities for choice has three related unfortunate effects. It means that decisions require more effort, it makes mistakes more likely, it makes the psychological consequences of mistakes more severe. Finally, the very wealth of options before us may turn us from choosers into pickers. A chooser is someone who thinks actively about the possibilities before making a decision. A chooser reflects on what's important to him or her in life, what's important about this particular decision, and what the short and long range consequences of the decisions may be. A chooser makes decisions in a way that reflects awareness of what a given choice means about him or her as a person. Finally, a chooser is thoughtful enough to conclude that perhaps none of the available alternatives are satisfactory, and that if he or she wants the right alternative, he or she may have to create it. A picker does none of these things. With a world of choices rushing by like a music video, all a picker can do is grab this or that and hope for the best. Obviously, this is not such a big deal when what's being picked is breakfast cereals, but decisions don't always come at us with signs indicating their relative importance prominently attached. Unfortunately, the, the proliferation of choice in our lives robs us of the opportunity to decide for ourselves just how important any given decision is. In the next chapter, we will look more closely at how we make our decisions and at the varying prices we pay for them.